Hello yet again, and welcome back for another rockin' episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. I'm Nikki. I am joined by Ocean Waves? No, nay, it is Amy Hollenkamp, registered dietitian to the max.
I was trying to cheer, but I feel like my cheering has become like white noise because of my child. My cheering has just gone mom mode.
Well, and I feel like I knew what you were doing, but I just wanted to mess with you anyhow.
Well, if it wasn't like as good as I wanted it to be, you know.
You're
it's
always
right.
as good as I want you to be.
We should.
Always.
Oh, whoa! I'm touched. We should tell the good people that we are recording on the day after Christmas because that's how much we love and appreciate you.
That is true. Well, and I was looking forward to talking to you too.
That's true. That's true.
We were off lollygagging for a little bit. But yeah, we've got to make sure you guys have a steady stream of podcast episodes because Nikki's going to be out for a couple weeks in January getting an ear surgery done. So we've got to do doubles for a couple weeks here to make up for that fact. But
yeah, you might be recovering.
I know. Honestly, this might be the one that posts the week of the surgery. I'm not sure. I haven't worked out the dates yet.
Right.
But you good people at home won't know the difference because we're going to have an episode every week, hopefully. But care to fill the folks in at home what we're going to be discussing? Again, they saw the title, so they know, but it still feels like the thing to do to verbally say so.
Yeah. We're going to be talking about testing, and I think we're going to be critiquing the idea of test don't guess, which is very rampantly being voiced out in the functional holistic space. I think if you've spent any time there, you've heard that expression. And again, it's kind of crazy how much that has taken wind, like that has really circulated where people understand it right out the gate, what people mean by that. But yeah, I feel like there's this level, I think it almost preys upon OCD and preys upon like needing certainty. But again, like at the same time, testing can also be helpful at times. So it's like this fine balance that we want to discuss about, you know, are these tests really the end all be all and should be viewed as almost like the Bible, and like there's nothing that we can question about some of these functional tests in particular. And again, when to take things with a grain of salt. You know, is the test consistent with your symptoms? Like these are, maybe we'll go through like some questions just to consider when you're trying to decide if testing is worth it, and then kind of like what tests, I don't know, like where do you think we should start?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that
there's so many angles. I feel like we could like verbally vomit a bunch of different directions here.
Yeah. I think that, again, to your point, I'm going to reword it slightly, is that I think as with most things in the healthcare and nutrition world, there are two extremes, and Amy and I have found ourselves somewhere in the middle. Yeah. Again, for like the umpteenth time. There's the world of say like conventional medicine, where, you know, you go to your general practitioner, your primary care, your GI doctor, and getting laboratory testing, not necessarily like colonoscopies, because they'll do a colonoscopy on anyone, but like laboratory testing, like blood work or a stool test or a urine test or a hormone test. Sometimes it feels like pulling teeth out of the conventional space, where it's like, you know, you ask for a thyroid test and you beg and plead for something other than TSH. Please, for the love of God, TSH plus anything else. And they're like, yeah, totally. And you think, oh yeah, we're getting it. And then the results come back and they only ordered TSH. And you're like, God damn it.
Right.
Or like the number of patients I've seen who have gone to not only one GI doctor, but numerous GI doctors, and they've never done a single stool test. Like not even to look at something kind of basic bitch like pancreatic exocrine insufficiency.
Right.
Or, you know,
I feel like that's not the
how protected.
Like to your point, that's not the usual. Like,
Yeah, it's not.
I've gone to when I was going through my gut stuff, I went to 2 GI docs. No one ran anything like that. It was all just like colonoscopy, endoscopy.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
the buco expensive invasive stuff gets
Right.
ordered moderately frequently.
Right.
But the stuff that like might actually give you usable information for less money and it's much less invasive, like a stool test, like that doesn't get ordered as much. So on the one hand, we have the conventional space where it's like they straight up deny functional testing. Like if you brought
Right.
a normal doctor, like a functional stool test or an OAT or a NutriEval, they'd look at you like you had 3 heads. But also like even the testing available within their world, they like don't even utilize that much, in my opinion. And then we have
Right.
the
They're less
functionals.
comprehensive with their
Yeah.
own tools.
Yeah. They're just underutilizing laboratory testing in general, I feel.
Like from the conventional laboratory
like
laboratory
LabCorp,
stuff that they
Quest.
can run, they're just not utilizing it. They're kind of doing
Yeah.
bare surface. And I feel like, again, a lot of the the GI tests are almost bare surface because they're just looking at what they can visualize. If they're doing colonoscopy, endoscopy, it's all like visual scoping
Yeah,
and looking and
gross
seeing
changes.
Right, seeing what's there, which can certainly be really interesting at times. But like, there's so many people that we work with where it's like, oh, my endoscopy is fine, my colonoscopy is fine, you're fine, and then the GI doc's like, oh, you got IBS, and it's like, whoa, based off just that one scope, that's
Yeah.
all we're doing. Yeah, so I agree. I like that you're kind of breaking it down from a conventional standpoint versus
Yeah.
you're giving us the 2 extremes. I enjoy this.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I'm glad because there's more. So that was one half of the continuum,
Yep.
right? Like way over on this side. And again, like I have understanding and empathy for both sides. I do fully understand that conventional doctors are stuck in a very broken system. They know it. They don't have as much control over the ability to order tests as you think they do. So like even if you request something like a SIBO test, I've had so many patients who say, oh, my GI doctor won't even order me a SIBO test. Oh, they're terrible. And it's like, they might not actually have the ability to do that. Like if it's like the policy of the clinic or the hospital that they work for to do it a certain way, like they
Right.
might be incapable of ordering that test, even if they personally would like to do so, or if they personally see the merit in it.
Right.
It might be like company policy or hospital policy, and they might not be able to do it, period. So beyond like, and they might not understand like how to order certain tests or how to interpret certain tests. Like that's a whole nother thing.
Right.
Or like, will ordering this test actually change the way I treat you as a patient? Like that's something that's running through their head a lot. So like I get where they're coming from to a certain extent, but it's also very frustrating for patients. On the other side of the world, on the other side of the continuum, we have my profession, like functional medicine, integrative medicine, naturopathic medicine, and they are just slap happy with all the tests, a test
Right.
for all the things.
Right.
Every person gets like a poop test, a urine test, a hormone test, an adrenal test, and a
Right.
SIBO test, a breath test, another test, another test. And it's like, damn, guys, like, can we
Right.
chill just a little bit on the $8,000 worth of testing that you expect every patient to do? And that's where you really hear test, don't guess. And I think, honestly, the ability to test for everything under the sun and have some degree of certainty was part of what kind of swooned me and got me into functional medicine in the first place. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people in my field feel that way. And, you know, it's tough. We hear the test, don't guess rhetoric coming from the functional world quite a lot. And I just don't think that's true. I think that part of it is that they're genuinely a little bit brainwashed into thinking like, all these tests are great and we have these wonderful tools that nobody else has and we're so special and we can test for everything. Hooray for us. We're changing medicine. We're the future of medicine.
Right.
So I think part of it is like an ego brainwashy kind of thing sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is like these lab companies have their clause in the functional profession really nicely.
Yeah.
Like when we go to seminars and conferences, there are booths from all of the lab companies, and they're selling to us, and they're convincing us to order their stuff. They might even be giving away a free test. I've gone to numerous seminars where it's like, oh, go over to the Genova booth and they're giving away a free GI effects for just being here at the conference, or like go over to the DSL booth and they're giving away a free GI map or whatever it might be. So, you know, I think the relationship functional medicine has with supplement companies and lab companies is not that dissimilar to like conventional medicine and big pharma.
Right.
Like the same kind of stuff of like, oh, encouraging the doctors to order my test and giving like discounts and free tests and doing, you know, calls with a rep to learn more about the test. And like a lot of it, and like, oh, the rep will come over to your office and teach you about the tests. Like it's really not that far away from what big pharma does with the medical industry, to be honest with you. So I think that there's also that element. And frankly, I think that functional medicine is expensive, and 99% of us don't take insurance.
Right.
And I think that we try to justify the cost to people by kind of like putting the testing piece up on a pedestal of like, well, of course you wouldn't go through your insurance-based doctor, or you wouldn't go to somebody cheaper than me because look at all the fancy testing I could do. Test, don't guess. If you're guessing, you have no idea what you're doing and you're doomed to have IBS forever.
Well, and I think that that's a good point, because they're almost saying that you're negligent if you don't run all these tests. And it's like, that's not true at all. You know, it's interesting because I know you see this too. Like we see people who have run all the tests and haven't gotten better. And it's like, and then they come to me and they're like, what tests do you need me to run right out the gate? And it's like, whoa, no, like, let's just take a step back and like see, okay, let's review past tests. Like you really might not need to do any more additional testing. Maybe some new updated blood work or something just to see like where that's falling. But, you know, I think it goes to show you how intense what you're saying, where the claws are in the functional medicine space, because it's not even coming from just the providers anymore of like, you have to test. It's the whole mentality has then sunken into the patients and the clients that are working with these providers, because they just think, oh, my answers to my problems are just going to be on this paper from the next lab that I run, right? It's like the answers are just all there. I just need to find the exact answers. And I think what happens is, unfortunately, the things that are right in front of your face get missed because you're so down the rabbit hole of all the testing. You know, we talk about it all the time. I can't tell you the last person that I looked at their nutrition and didn't have major changes to make. And it's like, these people have worked with 5 functional practitioners. You know, it's really negligent when you have a extreme diet change and don't look at how they're implementing the diet and ensuring that they're at least getting enough nutrition. From a calorie standpoint, not to mention like the micronutrition standpoint, which is probably impossible. But it's like, to me, that's way more negligent if you're just running a whole bunch of tests and not looking at diet lifestyle factors that, again, aren't sexy and like are hard to maneuver through. But to me, again, like that's where I always start. So when I work with someone personally, most of the time I don't order tests. Part of the problem, or part of it, is because they've run a gazillion tests and it's like they've made no progress. They have test fatigue. They also, again, just don't need more tests. It hasn't been helpful for them. And then again, like there are maybe the few people that come to me early on in their journey and maybe we do like a test or two or some some blood work, just like some more in-depth, thorough, conventional blood work. Maybe we add on some nutrition markers, things like that, just to kind of make sure like their B12 looks good and their iron looks good and, you know, some of these bigger micronutrients. But I would say it's very rare now that I run testing out the gate with people. Again, part of it's because they've done a lot of the testing. And it's just like, I haven't seen it be overly helpful for them. And I think part of it is that there's usually very obvious things they need to work on before doing any testing. And I think that that's one thing to like really, even if you're not working with a provider at the moment, to just self-reflect on your case as a whole and look through some of the basic unsexy things and just make sure you're covering those bases first before doing testing. And I'll tell people too, like, maybe we test at some point along your journey, but like if these factors aren't addressed, your baseline testing could be off in general, you know, like let's get you to a better baseline and then test. Because again, like if you are stressed to the max and you're running like a Dutch test, it's like, well, what's the point of doing that? Like, why don't you just work on the stress? Why do you need a test to confirm that and then work on it? It's like, no, you're stressed to the max. Why don't you kind of work on some stress management activities for the next 3 or 4 months, and we can kind of see where you're at, you know, like, so there's moments like that where it's, even if you were to test your stress chemistry to some degree with a Dutch test, I mean, it's not as comprehensive from a stress chemistry standpoint as it could be. But, you know, even if you were going to do that, why not actually do things that should improve your stress chemistry and see where you're at? Maybe you don't need to run that test at all. And you can just kind of continue on because the stress management helps. So yeah, again, like I think that there's, the simple things just get lost in the sauce, unfortunately, when you have this test, don't guess attitude. And to me, again, like it does sort of act like, oh, these practitioners that aren't testing are negligent. And there's maybe a little bit of that to the extreme you were talking about before with conventional medicine not running thorough blood work. And again, like I don't necessarily think it's negligence, it's just the system's broken. But like maybe you could argue that with some conventional providers that like, oh, like you're missing all these things by just doing a scope and not doing calprotectin or elastase.
Or iron.
Right, or iron. Like there's definitely scenarios where we've seen where it's like, you know, both functional and conventional medicine missing iron being low, and you're like, you know, like, so
like this is a big deal,
right? So, you know, it's so frustrating to me, the whole test don't guess attitude, because again, like it does come across that, oh, you're just negligent if you're not doing a whole bunch of testing, and it's like, no, that's not true.
It's marketing,
right?
Honestly,
right.
Like let's just call it what it is. Again, I think that there's maybe an element of these people genuinely think that they're like doing the world a service and they're on this crusade. And I think especially like when people are a bit newer into functional medicine, I could cut them a little bit of slack for being a bit naive.
Yeah.
You know, like I don't know if I ever really told people like test, don't guess, but I maybe had a hint of that in my practice style for like the first 5 years of practice, where again, like I was still kind of like swooned and charmed by how fancy functional medicine is and how cool, and like, oh my God, I can test for all these things. I need to learn about all these different tests. And like, I was still kind of charmed by that to some degree. And it felt special and different and sexy and cool and like profound. And it gave the illusion of certainty, which on some level was satisfying.
Right.
But like the longer you practice and the more discrepancies you see, I feel like the less I'm able to cut people slack for naivety, honestly. And like the longer people have been in practice, the more I'm just really frustrated by hearing this kind of stuff. Because again, it's like, I begin to wonder if the ratio starts to shift from just naivety and like they genuinely don't know any better. They don't know that they should be questioning this stuff. And they're like enchanted and charmed by functional medicine still. And I think that the ratio starts shifting into, no, this is like calculated marketing.
Yeah.
Whether it's 100% conscious or not, again, it's like you're trying to justify why somebody should come to see you in the first place. You're trying to justify why they need to stick around. Like, I've been to many business seminars and classes for like functional providers, and they talk about like, you use X, Y, and Z to kind of motivate people to get in the door, and then you structure your flow and your setup so that you do like the evaluation on day one, and then you make that person wait X amount of time before you're allowed to tell them the answers, because you need to make them like anticipate it and really want it and crave it. And, oh my God, I need to know. Sometimes too, like with testing, it just takes a week or 2 or 3 to get the results back in. So I'm not saying this happens always, but like, to throw my other profession under the rug a little bit, like the chiropractor who palpates you, does the scan, does the x-ray, and then makes you come back a week later for your second appointment where they actually adjust you, like, come on.
Right.
You have the ability to read the x-ray in-house. You have the ability to tell me what you palpated on day one, and you're just choosing not to do it because it's some marketing ploy. Just stop it. Just adjust me on day one.
Right.
But again, it's like they teach you this in seminars. But anyway, my point is that I really think that test, don't guess mostly is just marketing and trying to keep people coming in the door, keep them there once they're there, motivate them to keep spending money with you, and also motivate people to make the hard changes that you're asking them to make. Like if you mandate your patients do like this big crazy elimination diet and go through like die off symptoms and spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on supplements, like you'd better have something pretty strong to motivate them to keep them doing all of that, because they're going to be working really hard and maybe a bit miserable in the beginning of working with you. But yeah, it's kind of a reality of human neurology that fear is one of the strongest motivators.
Yeah.
Like motivating people by saying, this is where you could be, and you're going to be frolicking with the rainbows and unicorns and puppies, and it's going to be butterfly kisses from now on. Like, look how good your life could be. That doesn't work nearly as effectively as, look at what your life could be if you don't do this.
Right.
You're doomed. You're going to be sick forever and get cancer and die alone. And it's going to be horrible.
Right.
Like that motivates human beings way more effectively. And unfortunately, my profession knows that to some degree.
Yeah. And I think to your point earlier, like I do think I was into the testing as well. I was an analyst before I became a dietitian. Like talk about data and numbers and like hard facts with like, are my salespeople that I'm monitoring hitting their goals? Like what's their conversion rates? Like again, looking at data and numbers and like concrete facts was like part of my job at trying to kind of figure out and make decisions and advise people on what to do from a business standpoint was my job. So again, very early on in my gut journey, conventional medicine's approach did not sit well, because it's like, well, this is stupid. They just looked at me like with a scope and said, oh, you're good. Like, we're done here. And it's like, well, that didn't sit right. So of course, like functional medicine rung true of like, oh, they're like digging deeper, and this really aligns with my values as an analyst. But I also think too, again, like to your point, I know we've talked about this before as well. You should be able to assess someone's case and determine what tests make sense, even if you are going to run a test. It's like,
instead of doing the same tests on every single human being who walks through the door.
Right. So again, like, I feel like we talked about this in the red flags episode, but if a provider's literally, again, relies on the same 4 tests for every person from a functional medicine standpoint, like, I might be a little leery of that, because not everybody needs a breath test. Not everyone needs a Dutch test. Not everyone needs a stool test. Not everyone needs all these tests. So yeah, I think
it's just not very doctory.
Right. Right.
or like practitioner-y if you're not a doctor. But like, I'm just, and I don't know if he still does this, and I'm not trying to be rude to one individual, but like, I think I shared previously, I was looking at taking my mom to see Mark Hyman's office because my parents lived maybe an hour, hour and a half away from, I think he was in Springfield. They lived about an hour, hour and a half away from Springfield, Mass, when they lived in Massachusetts. And it was kind of early on when we were figuring out my mom's stuff. And I wasn't practicing myself yet. I wasn't able to run tests myself yet. So I kind of was like, oh, I'm going to take her to like the man. Right. And I remember talking, now this was, again, easily 12 years ago. But I remember talking to his office, and one of the things that was really peculiar to me was like, oh, yeah, here's the amount of money for the package, and you get X amount of appointments with the doctor and the nutritionist and the whoever. That was fine. But then also, like, every single new patient gets this amount of testing. And it was like a pretty fixed amount of testing for new patients. And I was like, I don't know. Part of me sees the appeal of that because honestly, like, you could be much more lazy with your intake process.
Yeah.
If you do that, theoretically, if you assume that the tests are 100% accurate, you could be more lazy with your intake process.
Right.
Like, maybe I don't need to talk to my new patients for 2 hours. Maybe I could trim it down to like half an hour and I just do a buttload of testing on them and I make them poof the cost in that way. But it was like, not every patient needs a hormone test and a breath test and a stool test and an adrenal test and a thyroid test and a nutrition, micronutrient test and a whatever test. It's like, maybe just look at the individual and determine what makes sense for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, why'd you go to medical school, dude? Like,
well, and I think it's like you said, it's almost a little lazy of like, oh, I'm not going to actually look at symptoms and analyze your case to determine like how much you need to spend on testing. I'm just going to throw everything at you and hopefully something comes up. But, well, and it's funny too, because sometimes if you're just relying on this static 4 or 5 tests, but you aren't running iron or you aren't running some of the, like, there might be symptoms of low iron. Well, if you're not analyzing the case beforehand and you're just having everybody do these tests, you might miss that at the beginning. So again, like, I almost think even if you're running a bunch of tests, but they're not the right fit for you, that's really problematic as well. And I think with all this stuff, like with all the testing, not even just arguing, how many tests to run at the beginning or like both sides of the extreme, it's also something that you've been working on more lately. We've definitely talked about it throughout time of like how accurate or consistent are these tests. And I know like we've talked through different stool testing inconsistencies that we've seen across the board. And, some of this stuff, like, we're still learning. So it's not necessarily like we expect everything to be 100% aligned or accurate or consistent. And that's something to always keep in mind when you're looking at some of these functional labs, is you can't really take them as God. You can't really take them as being like, the end all be all. And you can't take everything they say with like, especially if it's inconsistent with your symptoms. So like, there's been a number of, sometimes breath tests where it's like, this is really not consistent with your symptoms. Like, you're feeling amazing. You're having no gut symptoms. It's usually like people that retest and that they retest and they're positive. And it's like, well, you're feeling great. Like, I would just trust that and don't trust the test. I know it can feel a little bit alarming in my OCD brain too. Like, okay, like,
well, and you just stumbled on something too, or you just hit something. Like the idea of trusting a test more than you trust your own body.
Right.
Is really effed up.
Right.
Like,
again, especially some of these tests that like are less validated.
Like breath testing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like That one in particular is pretty mind-boggling how bad breath testing is in the sense of false negatives and false positives both, but
Yeah.
especially false positives.
Well, and again, I have one client that just like jumps out at me as like just a really extreme version of this. I was working with this client. She's probably mid-20s, super awesome, super great to work with. Made tons of progress, like went from being terribly bloated, terribly uncomfortable to like traveling. Her boyfriend lived out of state, so like traveling was always a problem and just stressful. And so she wasn't stressed with that anymore. Her bloating was like pretty much gone. She didn't have bloating. Her constipation was way better. And it's like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like she was like, oh, I'm just gonna my doctor's just ordering this one like breath test just to see. And I think it was a conventional doctor. I don't even think it was a functional doctor, if I remember right. And I'm like, okay, like if you want to do that, that's fine. Like I don't think you need to, but yeah, like I'll take a look at it. But she gets the results and she is devastated. And she sends them to me. And, I'm just like, I don't think
You feel better.
Yeah, I'm like, I think that we just ignore these and you continue what you're doing because it's working. And she was like, oh my God, like it was a sigh of relief for her. But it was still so like, again, there was probably 3 or 4 days that she didn't need to be like in despair and misery after getting these results before I could look over them.
It's a good thing she was able to listen to you too.
Right.
Because oftentimes that scenario goes a different way where like they get the result that they still have SIBO, they're still sick, oh my God, you're going to die right away.
Right.
And then we tell them, hey, but you were feeling a ton better. I think what we're doing is working. Why not, and there's a high rate of false positives with these tests. Why don't you just ignore the test and go with your gut, which is telling you that you're feeling a lot better? But then again, it's like that distrust and that certainty, that OCD issue kind of pops up. And a lot of times we kind of tell people that as like trying to be as like honest and empathetic and just like, I don't know, like matter of fact as possible and like just try to be helpful. Right? Like we just kind of lay it out like, hey, like these tests are not perfect, but you were feeling a ton better. Why don't we listen to your body instead and just kind of chuck this out? And a lot of times that need for certainty and that craving of certainty and that lack of trust, the person goes the other way and is like, no, but what if, oh my God,
Right.
like they don't know. And what if I'm going to go back to my GI doctor and do another round of rifaximin just in case. Oh my
Right.
God. And like, they go the other way and then they stop working with us or they stop trusting us and they go double down on the SIBO efforts because they still have SIBO.
Right.
And then they feel worse. And it's
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah, it's
goddamn,
like to what degree do you have like anxiety or OCD around the testing could determine your ability to move past that, even if your symptoms aren't consistent. And I do think it is funny because like now going through some exposure for postpartum OCD, it is kind of interesting because it's like, okay, if I was in that scenario, I'd probably freak out too and be like, is SIBO still there? I don't know. And like not liking that uncertainty. But it's almost like, well, what if SIBO is there, but you're feeling amazing? Like, I don't know. Like, again, like you could almost spin it that way. Like, what if you do have like more bacteria in your small intestines, but your symptoms are gone? Like,
is that a bad thing?
right. Like, do you just move forward? I mean, again, like, I think looking back at my case, I think there were times where I definitely didn't trust my body and wanted concrete testing. And I could totally see myself going down that rabbit hole of, oh, I need to like continue this process because I don't want to get back to where I was. And this is kind of indicative that I might slip back there maybe.
Yep.
And again, in reality, like I think exposure type work would be like, oh, what if it is there? And just sitting there, sitting in that uncertainty a little bit of like, okay, maybe the SIBO is there, but I'm feeling great. Like, am I going to let this kind of deter my life much longer and like prevent me from being present and moving forward in other areas. So yeah, I think it is interesting just kind of retrospectively looking back at probably what I would have done if I got like a positive breath test or something. But then kind of looking at maybe some of the dysfunction in my thinking at that time. But yeah, it's like, well, if you still had a little bit of SIBO, like, is it that big of a deal if it's not disrupting your life at all? Like, if you're just totally symptom free and moving through your day and accomplishing your goals, I don't know. I think you could kind of noodle on that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important with SIBO specifically, and we probably need to do an updated episode about SIBO breath testing and like the accuracy of it.
100%.
So we'll put that on the docket for sometime this year. But, like, how do we define SIBO?
Right.
And how do we define it, like, as a medical condition? Like, where does it become clinically actionable and deleterious to your health to the point where we need to do something about it? Like, that conversation is super not done yet.
Right.
And we could talk about the current research in an episode in the future here, but the reality is if you read research on SIBO and if you read research like comparing aspirates versus breath tests versus, gas sensing capsules and like the different ways of testing for SIBO, the jury's still very much out on what quantity of bacteria is acceptable in the small bowel and like what the microbiome looks like in the small bowel at all. So, but one thing I will share is that in virtually every study that I have read, like they'll oftentimes do breath tests on a group of people who have a condition like IBS or fibromyalgia or, diabetes, whatever it might be. They'll do breath testing for SIBO in a group of people who have a diagnosis or an illness. And then they will do breath testing on a group of healthy normals that are age matched and sex matched. So it's like if they do a breath test on a 33-year-old woman with IBS, they need to do another breath test on a healthy normal person, a healthy normal woman who's 33 who does not have IBS, for example. So, but when they do these studies where they're comparing, breath test positive rates in whatever their patient population is versus healthy controls, there's always a pretty fair chunk of people who are diagnosed with SIBO in the healthy normal group.
Right.
And they feel completely, totally fine. They are asymptomatic. They were just recruited for the study because they're healthy, normal people and they don't have anything major going on. And it's, it's like, okay, does that point a finger at how we're defining SIBO? Right? Like if there are a lot of healthy, normal, functional people getting told that they have SIBO when they're asymptomatic, like, does that actually matter? And like, are we using the correct cutoff points when we're labeling SIBO?
Right.
That's the biggest thing is I think that we're not using appropriate cutoff points anymore for the definition of SIBO.
Yeah.
But, like you could be a healthy, normal person with a positive breath test and you don't necessarily need to treat it. It might not be something treatable. It might be, who knows, maybe you have like ever so slightly more bacteria than the average. Like maybe you're just on the right side of the bell curve for, the average amount of bacteria in the small bowel. But like, is it at a point where we diagnose it as a condition? Or is it just like in the realm of normal?
Well, and I think that's what's interesting about that. I know we like always refer, I think it's that 2019 study where they looked at the small bowel microbiome of people that were like symptomatic versus those that weren't. And I do remember them saying that higher amounts of bacteria in the small intestines seem to be more linked to higher fiber diets. Like again, people that just ate more fiber in general, but that they weren't symptomatic. People with dysbiotic microbiomes were more symptomatic or just imbalances. So maybe you have too much of certain bacteria versus too much total bacteria. So yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion around how we label SIBO at this point. And we definitely need to do a breath test episode for sure.
Yeah. I think kind of going back to the point of this episode, though.
Yeah.
Which is testing overall. But again, good people, stay tuned. We'll talk about breath testing specifically soon. And like the validity of it and the utility of it. Again, I think that at the surface level, the first thing to just know is that this whole idea of like test, don't guess, and like we're going to give you 100% certainty of everything you need to work on, and like that's a farce. It's marketing. It's maybe a little bit of like, people kind of being brainwashed by their own profession to some degree and like sipping the Kool-Aid a little bit too much.
And both of us have sipped the Kool-Aid a little bit.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Like,
so it's not like we're not guilty of this too. Right. We're both not guilty of this.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get sucked in because it's cool. It's like, oh my God,
delicious
like
Kool-Aid.
Right. It's like, oh man, like look at all these markers we can run. Like it's so much more comprehensive than what a GI doc runs. Like, again, there's so many potential cool things about it. It's just like, one, you can't get lost in the test and the qualitative data suffers because, again, if you're just looking at quantitative number stuff, but you're not listening to someone's case at all, you're just hyper focusing on the numbers, you lose so much data. Like, so much data can come from just listening to a client very closely and getting a lot of like symptom information, what their day is like, what they're eating. Like, you can get so much from just listening to a client versus testing. I mean, testing has a place. It definitely does. But it's like, what I see happening is a lot of providers will favor the quantitative data and the qualitative data just gets totally lost in the sauce. There's no balance. There's no balancing act there.
Yeah. I think that probably the ratio, if I had to assign a number to it right now for me and the way I practice, I would say 80 to 90% of the information I gather is kind of what you described, like doing the intake, actually talking to people, listening to their history, asking them questions about their symptoms,
right.
Trying stuff and seeing how they respond to it, like that kind of gradual information gathering as we go along.
Right.
That's
right.
90% of it for me.
And I'm the same way. And I think that's one thing you mentioned that I just want to highlight. It's like, you can't have all the information in the beginning. Like, even if you're testing, you're still going to have to experiment and see if something works. Just because you tested positive for, Candida. Right. Or Pseudomonas or something. Like, maybe you go after that, but like that doesn't like reap benefits. Then you need to move on and do something else. Like, you don't need a test to do every one of those experiments.
Yes. Couple things. I just had this conversation last week with a patient. We got some stool testing back in, and mostly it was a conversation of like, ooh, your good guys aren't doing so hot.
Right.
And we need to feed them and nurture them. And there was one where I was like, yeah, like it's not crazy overgrown, but like this one, it might have actually been Pseudomonas, come to think of it. Like, yeah, this is a little bit overgrown. It's not insane, but it is there. And then like after the appointment, she messaged, or I think it was after, it might've been during the appointment, but she asked me like, okay, and is this the reason why I'm so bloated? I was like, I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. Like, and that's the God's honest truth. Like, we could have a crazy high level of something and we could successfully kill it or eradicate it or lower it, and you could still have your symptom.
Right.
Right. Like, and I think I shared with you, I worked with a guy, he had like the highest Pseudomonas I think I've ever seen on stool testing. It was an astronomical amount of Pseudomonas. And we treated it hoping that was the cause of his gut pain, particular pain. And we did a repeat test. The Pseudomonas was completely gone. and he was still in pain.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, well, whenever we get test results back, there's this unspoken assumption that this is the thing that's causing your problems. It could just be there. It could be
Right.
there and not contributing to that particular symptom or any particular symptom whatsoever. And it could just be hanging out. Or the test could be straight up wrong and maybe you don't have Pseudomonas.
Right.
But the way you kind of determine it is that you experiment and you try something, you try to treat it, you see how you feel, and if you feel better and you're able to eradicate the boogeyman, then you could put 2 and 2 together and say, yeah, I think that boogeyman was the cause of my woes. If you eradicate the boogeyman and you still feel like crap, guess what? The boogeyman was not the boogeyman you thought it was.
Right. Right.
That's just, but you
Yep.
don't know that until you try stuff and you try to treat the thing.
Right.
So
Right. And again, like, testing can't really predict how the outcomes totally is basically what you're saying. Like, it seems that way. I think it's marketed that way in the test don't guess model of like, we just need to discern exactly what the problem is, implement this exact protocol, and then you're going to be good to go. And it just doesn't work out that way. I think it was that easy. We wouldn't see these clients that have been to multiple functional medicine providers, multiple conventional providers. Like, I think it's so important to recognize that there has to be some degree of action and experimentation, and that in and of itself can help with the information gathering. So I like that you pointed that out. Like, that, even if something goes terribly wrong, again, we never want that, but like, even if something goes like, whoa, you took HCl and it caused a lot of burning, or, you know, maybe there's like still lingering gastritis or something. Maybe we need to address that. Or you took herbals and you felt horrifically miserable. Maybe you need to address some liver and get like detoxification pathways opened a little bit. Like, there are some like really interesting things that can come up when things don't go well. It's not something that we want, like, for you to be getting worse or something from an experiment, but like, it still can be valuable information moving forward. But yeah, I think
when nothing happens,
right?
Too. Like, if you if you have candida on a stool test and you take caprylic acid and you like a kind of typical anti-candida supplement and you don't feel any better, that starts to weaken the hypothesis that candida is a driving force in your symptoms.
Right.
And then similarly, so okay, you try caprylic
So
acid.
Nikki,
And
I
you
shouldn't take 6 other antifungals in a row until I get the one that fits.
I mean,
I'm being sarcastic.
I know.
Anyone can't tell.
It's a balance, right? Like,
Right.
when that sort of thing happens, if I'm really, really convinced that the candida is a big deal, for example,
Right.
like, we'll try one antifungal, and if that one doesn't work, you know, we'll maybe try one other one. If we've tried 2 antifungals that typically work pretty well, and then you're not feeling any better, I'm typically starting to question if that hypothesis was correct. And that's where I would like vocalize that to the patient typically of like, hey, like, we will only want to chase this candida thing for a little bit longer because I'm starting to get the hint that maybe this isn't the biggest thing for you.
Right.
And then maybe you try like a third one. Maybe.
Right.
That's a big maybe. But like, no, I would not try antifungal after antifungal after antifungal after antifungal. And similarly with like SIBO,
Right.
I wouldn't, you know, if like berberine doesn't work for you and then oregano doesn't work for you and then allicin doesn't work for you, like, I don't know if I would make a point to like keep trying antimicrobials for SIBO.
Right.
Like, it's like, at what point do you step back and question if the hypothesis was incorrect? Right.
And I think that we've talked about this too. That's where our work as providers, it's almost like a little dance or like an art. You have to almost have some instincts. I think the longer,
I don't know. I'm doing like a dance.
Nikki is,
I'm just feeling it.
I
and
feel,
art.
I feel like now I'm picturing you working with clients, like
Doing this?
doing dances of like, ooh, let me figure out what antifungal I want to use. Ooh,
My one-handed interpretive dance. Well, actually, can I pause you for 1 second?
sure.
I do have just a teeny bit of woo in me. So like I was talking to a patient, I think last week, and saying I wanted to mix up some tinctures for her. And I was like, now I'm probably going to sign off on your chart note and get the notes over to you tomorrow, not today, like I normally would, because I want to go down to my little herbal apothecary. And I like to just like look at all the bottles and let the herbs speak to me a little bit.
Yeah.
And then I line them up and I kind of like arrange them in the way, like this one's going to be most of the tincture, then this one, and there's barely any of this one. Like I kind of like to visually see the bottles and let them speak to me. And I was like, yeah, I know that sounds a little woo. And she's like, no, I'm all for it. Go for it. I'm just like, okay, cool. So I don't do this with patients typically, like the little dance I did for you with the squiggly arm, but I do have just the tedious bit of woo in me. So
yeah, well, we all, I feel like, have to have some woo for some fun. But yeah.
But it is an art.
Yeah, I think it's an art and you have to trust your instincts. And I think the longer that I work with clients, the more I feel confident trusting instincts of like, like this person isn't really leaning heavily on this area, but I think that they should. Like, again, there's just something about when you've heard a lot of cases and seen what has worked with different people. Doesn't mean it's always right, like that our instincts are always right, but like I think you get better over time the more you do it. And I do think, again, it's a bit of an art. Again, like there's not necessarily this 100% certainty on our end. Maybe we can increase the percentage of certainty just over time and experience working with people. But again, we can't really be 100% certain about anything because it is an art and it relies on kind of instincts and trial and error.
And we're on Earth.
Well, and again, like
certain on planet Earth,
we can't control circumstance of the client. Maybe their parent dies when we're working with them, and it's like, like that's terrible. Like I'm so sorry that you're going through that. Like it's horrible. But I don't necessarily think your gut's probably gonna take a hit during that time. So again, like there's circumstances that come into play. Maybe you get fired from your job or something. Again, like laid off, that can really affect progress too, outside of some of the work you're doing with a provider. But yeah, I think it is a bit of an art for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables in human life for sure. Yeah, it's I want to get to talking about some individual tests now, I think, because we've probably dashed all of the hopes and dreams of our listeners now. Only the diehards are listening at this point, and 53 minutes into the episode here.
Maybe we should tell people to write a review before we end.
We could. You heard Amy.
Yeah,
listen
write
to
a
Amy.
review.
Don't listen to me. Yeah,
especially like on Spotify, they just started doing reviews not that long ago. So if you want to leave us a 5-star review or an Apple review, we would greatly appreciate it. Sometimes we put it at the end. I feel like no one hears it. Like they're all like, well, let's wrap up. And then no one hears that.
Click.
You don't have to though. If you don't want to, no pressure.
Yeah, you do you, man.
Right.
But just know that we would deeply appreciate it. And it'll help us help more people.
Right.
Really, like that's the end of the day. But yeah, I think, kind of trying to get into what testing might be worthwhile, that conversation.
Yeah.
Again, don't put all of your eggs in any of these baskets. But I think this goes against everything that conventional medicine or functional medicine kind of builds itself up to be in a way. The unglamorous, unsexy LabCorp and Quest stuff that your conventional doctor could run if they had the ability or the time or the desire to, those are going to be your best bet, typically. So like a CBC, an iron panel, TSH, homocysteine, like those things are typically, honestly, here's what it is. LabCorp and Quest are very reputable, big companies. They bill insurance all day, every day. So they have to be very mindful about things like insurance fraud and
Right.
not defrauding insurance. They're available in every hospital. And, you know, in another country, there's probably the equivalent of this. But in the United States, these are the two big ones we have. Like, these are the labs that you could get run at any hospital, any clinic, any doctor's office. And they have a really big reputation to live up to, and they have a lot of expectations to live up to. So they do,
Yeah.
generally speaking. Now, they're not probably 100% perfect either, but generally speaking, these are going to be the most reputable tests that you can get. So if you were to order like calprotectin through LabCorp or Quest, fair amount of certainty that it would be decent. If you were to do like pancreatic elastase or a parasite test, or again, like TSH or an inflammatory marker like CRP, these are the things like, I guess, LabCorp and Quest picked up these tests because they are so validated and so well understood that at some point LabCorp was like, yeah, this is legit enough that we can bring it into
Right.
our suite of stuff.
Right.
But like, if it's not legit enough that LabCorp wants to bother doing the test, or Quest like won't do the test, that is almost like a little bit of a red flag of like, ooh, okay, maybe this test isn't super well validated. Because like, if LabCorp and Quest are not willing to do the test themselves, that might be a little bit of a red flag sometimes.
Right. And I think, again, like, I think the argument from a lot of the functional labs is like, oh, we validate it in-house. And it's like, oh, I don't know. Like,
Okay.
right. So I think you're right. There's a little bit of a red flagginess to that. And I think one other aspect I'll add to this is like, it might be good to find yourself a PCP that is willing to kind of work with you and is okay with you requesting labs. I know, again, like, it can be challenging. I'm not saying it's easy, but like, my PCP, totally conventional, super collaborative. He runs really thorough labs just on everybody. Like, he has a sheet that has like the lab like codes, which could be something you could take to your doctor too. Like, if there's a lab that you're requesting that they don't run often, sometimes they just like, they can't find the code. And like, if you bring just the actual like LabCorp code or the Quest code, that can help them. But yeah, my PCP, he has a sheet that he has for all his clients that he gets blood work, and he just checks boxes of which ones he wants run. But it's like really thorough. Like, he'll run nutrient labs, he runs really thorough thyroid labs. So again, like, I think
Make the doctor's job easier.
right. Well, and again, I do think just finding yourself a good PCP can be really, really valuable. I think, again, like, people are very frustrated with conventional docs, but I will say, like, I've had decent PCPs over the last few years. I really like my current one, but even the one prior to that, the one prior was like more of a direct primary care, so I had to pay like a monthly fee. Some of those, again, might be worth it. Some of them do in-house lab testing. Like, mine did in-house lab testing for the direct PCP at like a really low cost. But then my current PCP is all insurance based. He just runs really thorough lab work. So again, like, if you can find a PCP, maybe he doesn't even understand everything, but like is willing to be like, hey, I'm not going to argue if you want your magnesium serum run, or again, like, you know, if you want some of these like more nutrient based labs run or thyroid labs run, like, I'm not going to argue with you. I also think too, if you're working with another provider, so like sometimes I'll do this where I'll put a note in a client's chart and tell them, like, I'll write out like, oh, I'm so and so, I'm working with so and so on these issues. Here's some labs that we think would be really helpful. And I kind of like describe why. It's not long, but it's like maybe a short 3-paragraph thing.
Yeah.
The last paragraph's just like, if you want to contact me, here's my information. So like, sometimes if you can work with a dietitian or another provider that can like help push a
Grease
little
the wheel
bit.
a little bit.
I feel like every time I've done that, we haven't had an issue. So again,
I would
like,
agree.
that could be another thing to
Yeah.
to consider.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've done that with patients too, where I've like written a little bit of a note, and I usually I will fax that into the office,
Yeah.
and I will have them print it and bring it in. Because like I have zero faith that doctors get any of the faxes that go to the
Right.
clinic.
Right.
Even if theoretically are like, oh, print it and put in the chart note, they probably
Right.
won't.
It's like
It just-
immediately, like it's like just faxing straight into the trash can.
Yeah,
or the
that's-
shredder, you know?
It's worth trying, but
Right.
I generally have that assumption. So yeah, I think that having somebody like in like the healthcare field kind of helping advocate for you, but even like if you're on your own and you don't
Yeah.
have somebody like us, I like the idea of writing down. You can write down the LabCorp or Quest code and the exact name of the test.
Right.
Like, don't just write CRP. Like, write down C-reactive protein, comma, cardiac
Right.
with the code so that they can type it in their system. A couple other things to think of. So you can write down the exact names of the tests and the codes. If you are savvy enough that you could bring in like a journal article, even if it's just the abstract, like the title of the article and the citation and the abstract,
Right.
sometimes bringing that in could be helpful. Like, just don't print the whole article because they're not going to read it, but maybe just like print off the abstract and like highlight one or two lines. If you can find like an article about, iron and IBS or thyroid, hypothyroidism and IBS, like even just bringing that in, because I know, and I don't know how common this is, but I have a good friend who's a psychiatrist, and he's very like integratively minded, but he works in like a traditional insurance billing type clinic. And he has said before that the policy of either his supervisor or the clinic as a whole is like, if he recommends anything natural whatsoever, even if it's like magnesium supplements,
Right.
he has to provide a PubMed ID in the chart notes. If he does not provide a PubMed URL or PubMed ID and he recommends something natural to a patient, he could get shit canned for it.
Oh my God.
So on the off chance that that's a policy that's not uncommon, again, if you were requesting a test, again, like magnesium, if you could dig up an article about like magnesium and poor sleep, or magnesium deficiency and low energy, magnesium deficiency and IBS, bloating, whatever your symptoms are, if you could like tie the two together in
Right.
some way and print it and like write the PubMed ID at the top of the sheet, that might give them the cannon fodder to be able to override some of these policies or like advocate for you more. That's maybe a bit above and beyond. The other thing I have found that sometimes helps grease the wheel is if you could verbally tell them explicitly that you don't care what it costs, you will pay for it.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of doctors, when you actually question them, they don't want to run tests for you because they're worried that it's going to cost an arm and a leg, because it's not going to be able to go through insurance, and then you're going to get a surprise bill, and then you're going to call and bitch and complain to their supervisor, and they're going to get fired because they ordered an expensive test that wasn't covered by insurance, and then you ranted and raved like a psychopath, and you got them fired or you got them in trouble, honest to God. So I have found also when providers are reluctant to order testing, sometimes if you just tell them, hey, I know this thing probably won't be covered by insurance. I'm okay with it. I'm fully prepared to pay the out-of-pocket cost if it does not get billed through insurance properly. That takes a big liability off of them.
Right.
Now, again, like it could still be hospital policy or hospital or clinic availability. Like they still might be bona fide incapable of ordering a SIBO test. Like they don't have a single SIBO kit in the whole house.
Right.
And they don't have a relationship with a lab that does SIBO testing, and there's an explicit policy against SIBO testing. So you might still come up with, what's like a gambling term? I feel like aces would be good. Jokers, you might still come up with jokers. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up now. You might still come up empty-handed
Right.
with all of this effort, but these are a couple of the hurdles I've seen where like if you help the practitioner understand that you're not going to freak out about a surprise medical bill that you're just going to pay the out-of-pocket cost if the insurance doesn't pay for it. If you could provide them some sort of legitimate documentation about why this thing might matter to you in your case, and if you could make their job as easy as possible and provide them with, again, some degree of research proving your point and some degree of like, here's the name of the test, here's the code, you might find that you're able to get some testing done.
Yeah. And again, like, worst comes to worst, you could order direct.
Yeah.
A lot of my clients will do that. Like, if they just don't want to like deal with their doctor, or they know their doctor is just like not cooperative, they might just go to like Ulta Labs or Direct Labs,
Yeah.
and you can order it yourself. And some of those panels aren't bad. Like, you can get a fairly comprehensive panel for like $300 maybe, something like that. That's fairly good. That has
Direct Labs is pretty decent. I used to use them before I had a license.
Yeah.
When I like wanted some LabCorp stuff done, like when I was in school.
Yeah.
But I wasn't able to order directly through LabCorp myself. I would do
Right.
Direct Labs quite a lot.
Right.
And I've had people in FODMAP Freedom do that before.
Yeah. Just as another option. Again, like, I think best case is you can find like a PCP that's good. Like, again, I think everyone should have a good PCP in general, but and again, it's not easy. It can take a little bit of searching. My current PCP was actually referred to me by my functional chiro that I didn't love, but my PCP is really good. So I'm at least happy that I got found a really good PCP from my functional chiro. But sometimes even asking like maybe a more holistically minded person if there's any PCPs that are more conventional that they like is another option too.
Yeah, like I like that idea. Like ask your chiropractor or acupuncturist, or heck, even if you're a part of any sort of community or group, like if you go to a yoga class at a yoga studio, if you're chatting with people, you could ask somebody in like the yoga community that you go to, or like the running group or whatever. You know, if you hang out with any groups of like health conscious people, they might know of some good people. Facebook groups sometimes can be helpful for this too. Like I know I found our PCPs because we had moved earlier in the year, so we had to find new doctors, and it was kind of a combination of I asked in like a local mom group or like a women's group or something, and I just put out feelers like, hey, we just moved to the area.
Right.
We need, my husband and I need a new primary care doctor. Here's like some of what we're looking for. And people are happy to weigh in when you do that typically. And then I was like hanging out with another parent on like a play date with my kiddo. And we just got talking about like his primary care doctor. I was like, oh, are they good? Maybe we should go to them. And so yeah, just asking people. Also, pro tip for the ladies out there, I have found, this is what I had done up until this recent move. Sometimes if you look up a birth center, sometimes they also do primary care for women. So for a long time, I went to a birth center, even though I was not pregnant and I had no intention of becoming pregnant or birthing again. I stuck with the birth center for many years after my daughter was born because they also offered primary care for women of all ages. So, and I've had patients do that too, where like they need a new primary care and we just go on Google Maps and type in birth center. But some birth centers have like nurse practitioners or doctors or something on staff. And because they're hanging out with nurse midwives all the time, and, the midwives are doing hippy dippy stuff and having you, I don't even know, like, I don't even remember all the hippy dippy stuff that we did with the birth center anymore. But like, because they're hanging out in a clinic with midwives all day, the people who work in the birth center tend to be very open-minded and very hippy dippy also. And I've had some patients do really well doing that and just working with a birth center for their primary care. Again, this is going to be for women, not for men.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. It's a great idea.
I think, rounding out the rest of this half of the conversation, for functional tests, Like if you were working with a functional provider, for example, or if you were thinking about getting functional testing run, it's a little bit the wild, wild west. As you mentioned, the companies will say that their test is validated, but it's validated in-house. And you start getting into this weird territory of like, okay, well, how did you determine your reference ranges for all of these things that you're measuring? And it'll be like, we like sampled 100 healthy people and took the averages. It's like, all right, well, like 100 healthy people, quote unquote healthy people in like Asheville, North Carolina, like,
Right.
all right. Apparently that's what Genova does.
Yeah.
They do a sample of, it was either 100 or 150 people that they deemed to be healthy, and they just like take the average from that group of people. It's like, I don't know, man.
Right.
Like that's decent. That'll give you some ballpark idea maybe. But it's honestly, it's just up to the labs to determine what they want to put on their report.
Right.
The famous one I've rambled about before is frickin' Genova, the GI effects, for some god unknown reason, they put a bacteria on the PCR portion of their test, pseudoflavinifractor. And I do not know why. I have looked this thing up on PubMed. I've looked it up on Google Scholar. I can only find like one study in human beings that actually mentions this bacteria, and it's just like BT dub, this is there.
Right.
It's not known to be an important player in the ecosystem by any stretch of the imagination. 90% of the research is on chickens.
Yeah.
Broiler chickens. And when I talk to Genova and I ask them like, hey man, why do you have this on this report? Because I looked on PubMed and I could only find one study regarding the human microbiome that mentions this bacteria, and it doesn't seem like it's not known to be super important right now. And I'm curious, out of like the 20 or 25 things you chose to list on this report, how did pseudoflavinifractor make the list? And they literally, their answer was just like, well, we felt it was important.
Right. Oh my God.
What does that mean?
Right.
What does that mean? You felt it was important? Why?
Right.
Why? So anyway, so like the labs make shit up to some degree or another. I'm pretty convinced at this point. I think, I don't even know, man. I don't know. I love stool testing. I don't tend to do the expensive stool tests anymore. Like, I just don't think that they're worth it. I've seen way too many weird things and inconsistencies, especially with the GI map.
Yeah.
I had not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 people in a row, all supposedly who had detectable levels of Giardia on GI maps.
Yeah.
Like, what are the odds of that happening?
Yeah.
And it's not like these people are like avid hikers. And like these are people who like work from home. One of them had a newborn baby and like hadn't left home in 2 months.
And when you do, have you done like follow-up testing with any of those? Did they?
No, so with that particular issue, I got them all kind of back to back. So what I saw, the first one that came back and I was like, ooh, doggy.
Yeah.
We need to treat this.
Right.
And I met with the patient and we were like, yeah, we're going to treat this. And I recommended some herbs or something. The second person, and I was like, well, LP, what are the odds of that happening?
Right.
That's crazy. So I told that patient, like, yeah, we should treat this. And again, I recommended herbs. The third person comes back. And again, this is all within like 2 weeks. The third person comes back in and I was like,
yeah.
Wait a minute. This is now very fishy. And I told the person, I was like, all right, look, this is what we got. I'm finding this very hard to believe because you're my third person in a row who had Giardia supposedly, and I'm beginning to really question this test. I find this frankly unbelievable. But I said, raw, like eating 1 clove of raw garlic per day for like 3 days has a weirdly high eradication rate for Giardia. So if you feel like you want to do something about it, just in case, let's have you chew up a clove of raw garlic once a day for the next 3-4 days, just to be safe. And they were like, yeah, okay. And then the 4th and the 5th came back in, and I straight up I was like, I do not believe this at all.
Yeah.
Like, I think this is absolute horseradish. Again, if you want to, if it's freaking you out to see this anyway, and you're like not in the same mental place that I am, if you want to try to treat it, just eat the garlic for 3-4 days and be done with it. But I really don't think we need to treat it any more than that, because I am reasonably sure that this is rubbish.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the progression of it. But I just, again, after like the 3rd, 4th, 5th came back in, I just no longer believed it. So I didn't even bother with repeat testing at that point, because I was like, no, like there's no way 5 people in a row had Giardia, especially when they're people who do not leave their house.
Right.
This makes no sense. So anyway, and Lord knows people who have followed my YouTube channel for a while probably saw I've seen a lot of discrepancies, especially with the GI map, in recent years, to a point where I no longer recommend it. I no longer order that test. But, again, like, I don't think a lot of functional tests are much better, though.
Right.
That's the thing. Like, I'm not on a witch hunt to get them. It's, again, like Genova over here saying, we felt that pseudoflavin factor was important.
Right.
And they're not, like, saying why.
Right.
Like, that's also fishy. And then you have, like, the culture-based stool samples, which are absolute garbage. And it's like, you're out. The way to look at it that actually makes sense, I think, is that our understanding of the gut microbiome is in its infancy.
Yep.
Like, the gut microbiome research world is in the stage where surgery was in like the 1700s.
Right.
Right? Like, I think I kind of am borrowing this from Michael Pollan. So surgery in like the 1700s, interesting, maybe interesting to watch, but you don't want it practiced on you necessarily just yet either. They're like still putting leeches on people at that stage of the game. So we're kind of just dealing with a really imperfect understanding of this ecosystem, and we're dealing with imperfect testing in general.
Right.
And that's just the way the cookie crumbles. If we were having this conversation 100 years in the future, it would be a little bit better, I'm sure. But I think that just going into it knowing that all gut testing is going to be somewhat flawed, particularly microbiome-based testing, like that's going to be at least somewhat flawed. And that kind of questions like stool testing, oat testing, breath testing, just knowing that they're a bit imperfect, I think gives you some,
Yeah.
I don't know if freedom is the right word, but you could take away the expectation that these are going to be like the infallible truth. But as we talked about with Jason Harvillak a couple episodes ago, like I do think there are some stool tests that are pretty decent. The whole genome sequencing tests are becoming more available, and they're getting better and better. I still really like 16S testing, like Ombre, hashtag not sponsored. But like I do a pretty fair amount of Ombre based testing, which is 16S, which is very cheap and moderately reliable.
And I will say too, like one thing that I think for someone to order an Ombre test and to interpret it, like you probably have to know a decent amount about the microbiome versus, if you're a provider and you use the GI map or you use Genova and they're flagging stuff for you, like
True.
I feel like they're trying to make things a lot easier for providers, but I think again, like if you're going to use an Ombre, like I think they're great. Or they're decent. Again, like I think they're decent tests, the Ombre test. I think it takes more interpretation, and that might be another reason why providers don't use them as much. Yeah.
And I've been told that also by the BiomeFX people, which is a whole genome sequencing test offered through Microbiome Labs and Cosmos ID. They straight up told me when we talked about it, they were like, yeah, our biggest hurdle is marketing it because to providers, because it takes so much more effort and so much more knowledge about the microbiome to actually use this information and interpret it.
Right.
And it's so much easier when you get like a GI map or a Genova test where it's like, this is in the red.
Right.
And this is in the green.
Yeah.
And this is in the red. And like, and they give you these like clinical guides where they literally tell you like, you know, a couple sentences worth of information about E. coli
Right.
or Klebsiella or whatever. And they take out a lot of the work and a lot of the need for research
Right.
from their tests. And like ombre, you do have to research it a bit.
Right.
And also like BioMFX, like that sort of thing, you have to research it a bit more. I will say too, like Jason Haverlack, the guy that we had a couple weeks ago, he has courses that are very reasonably priced, like maybe $100, $200, $300, somewhere in that ballpark. And he talks about 16S testing and approximate ranges for like where you want certain bacteria. So you could take a fairly reasonably priced course from him. That's also, I give one of the little free goodies that I give in FODMAP Freedom is like a guide for stool testing, and it's based off of 16S testing. But I literally give the range of like where it should be, and then some ideas for what to do if it's high or too low, and like what raises and what lowers stuff. But I kind of give people, it's essentially like the template that I use when I write up reports for my patients, but I made it into like an ebook-esque kind of thing. And you could just print it off and like fill in your numbers from Ombre, and it helps you interpret it.
Yeah.
I forget what I actually called that thing. Consumer's Guide to Stool Testing Analysis, something like that. But it's basically like a template for Ombre type stuff. But yeah, I think, you know, for like $100 a test, give or take a little bit, like it's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
I have found it to be helpful. And worst case scenario, even if it is totally garbage, at least you're only out $100 instead of like $400, $500, $600 with these functional tests.
Right.
So, but I have found it to be usable. And that's probably the one test that I order on almost everybody at this point is Ombre, just because it's fairly usable, reliable information I have found, and it's cheap enough. And it's cheap enough that we could do the occasional retest and check in on stuff. But it's usually going to give me something to go off of, at least initially.
Yeah.
I usually do some combination of that plus some LabCorp stuff, like, again, iron, TSH, you know, T3, CRP, that sort of stuff. And then I kind of call it a day.
Yeah.
A lot of the other functional tests I don't bother with. Hormones in particular, I haven't done hormone testing in a lot of years because I finally came to the place where I was like, you know what? The hormones, minus thyroid special, but like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, like
Kind of downstream.
Yeah, they're downstream. The hormones, the sex hormones are just reacting to everything else.
Right.
And you need to have like the protein and the vitamins and the minerals and the cofactors to make the hormones. And you need your body, particularly women, like your body needs to know that you are nourished enough to be able to carry a baby.
Right.
So if we just clean up the nutrition and clean up the gut, the hormones are going to sort themselves out organically anyway, 99% of the time. So like, why should I waste $300 on a Dutch test when it's just a downstream issue anyway? I will say I do test testosterone in men somewhat frequently, but again, I do that through like LabCorp.
Yeah.
I don't do a functional test for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, if there was like maybe a fertility reason or something and you had already addressed a bunch of other issues or menopause or something, again, like if there was some major change, I could see sex hormone testing in particular to be maybe helpful. Again, if you feel like you've covered a lot of the other bases, like if you're trying to hone or something, tweak certain things. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of just kind of like, oh, you have hormonal imbalances, run Dutch. And there's like, again, you haven't covered any of the other bases that would probably just naturally take care of the issue.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, even if you do get testing back, if there's a lot of variables and like wild cards, contributing, you're not going to know what to do.
Right.
Anyway. Like, okay, if you have crappy sleep and also you're estrogen dominant, like, I don't know, is the crappy sleep contributing to your estrogen dominance? Maybe, probably. I don't know. Like, why don't we just focus on the sleep, since that's going to affect everything else anyway?
Right.
And then we'll just kind of leave the estrogen piece. And to your point, like, there are cases where something like hormone testing might make a lot of sense. I think that they're few and far between, and especially for the listeners of this podcast.
Right.
Again, stool testing can be useful. I think that most of them are hot garbage at this point.
Right.
Similarly, too, like nutrient panels. Why are we bothering with big old nutrient panels when we're not actually assessing the diet?
Right. Right. Like, don't we want to first look at, are you getting enough of total calories? Are you getting enough of total protein? Are you getting enough of micronutrients? Like, don't we actually want to assess?
If you're not eating enough B12, it's kind of not a shocker that you're deficient in B12.
Right. Right.
Or, insert name of nutrient here.
Right. Agreed.
So, yeah, it's actually, I'll share this as a little side note that's interesting.
And then we do probably have to wrap up soon. My boobs,
Yes.
my boobs are gonna burst.
We can't have that.
My one right boob.
The one that Cece likes.
Yeah, the other one's just trash now. It's
chilling.
It's like teeny tiny, and the other one's huge.
Mom life.
So that's gonna be an interesting dynamic when I'm done breastfeeding. What this looks like.
Yes, true. Shoot, now you're due. Oh, so you may or may not know this. So I've been tracking my nutrition and chronometer for a few months as part of this like ongoing stool testing kind of endeavor. And now it's kind of become habitual for me to some degree, but I'll probably quit it in the next couple weeks after I get this next sample out for my next experiment. But what's interesting, I just did a Nutri-Eval on myself too. And I was looking, because last time I did a Nutri-Eval, a couple of my B vitamins were low, and my glutathione was low. I was like, ooh, okay, that's no bueno. So it's been like a year and a half, maybe even 2 years, and I finally redid another one. But I've been taking N-acetylcysteine for a while. In part because I just had some bottles that expired out of my inventory and I was too cheap to throw them away. And I was like, I'm sure these are still good. I'll just take them.
Right.
So I've just been taking N-acetylcysteine from my expired inventory for a while. And I figured I had low glutathione anyway. I might as well. So I've been taking NAC, and I've been much more diligent about taking my multivitamin, which I had not been diligent about. Well, my new Nutri-Eval looks really good by comparison. Like, B vitamins are good, glutathione's looking good. What's funny, though, is I went in chronometer on the back end, and I was able to see, I forget how you do it, but in the pro side, you can like take the averages for everything across all the days that the person filled out. And on average for like the 3 months, it was like, calories, spot on. Fat, carbs, protein, like all of that is pretty spot on. Some of my B vitamins, not the best, which surprises me because I do eat meat. But like on average, my B vitamins, maybe a little bit on the lower end. But then I look down at like the amino acid breakdown. You know, the one amino acid that I don't get a ton of in my diet?
What is it?
Cysteine.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I could have figured this out without a $300 Nutri-Eval.
Right.
I could have theoretically figured this out for much cheaper.
Yeah.
With like the paid version of Chronometer and just taking the average of my diet for a month or 2 or 3.
Right.
But literally like all of the amino acids were like, great. Great. And it wasn't terrible either. It was like cysteine, I think whatever benchmark they want me at, I think I'm hitting like 80% of that benchmark. So it's not atrocious, but it's definitely the lowest out of all my amino acids.
Right. And like maybe like if you were sick or like, again, like maybe you're using more of the cysteine to make glutathione.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just laughed about that because I was just like, oh, I didn't need a $300 test.
Right. I know.
There's the info right there. It was in my diet all along.
Oh my goodness.
All right. Well, let's wrap this up quick, people, before Amy's boob explodes.
Yeah,
boob singular, not plural. Because
Gonna
again, Cece only
explode
likes
everywhere, shoot out, dramatic
be-
flare to the end of this episode.
That would be indeed dramatic flair. Well, you already told the good people to please
Yeah.
write us a nice review. So I don't need to reiterate that, although I just did. I don't know. We'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah.
Peace out, guys. Bye.